Okay. The next item on the agenda, we had talked at the last meeting that the council, Mr. Gebbia especially, wanted to have an overview of the redevelopment powers law. And I mentioned that I did want to have a standalone work session, and I still do. But because there have been questions from the public or comments from the public, we are going to talk about it this evening. And I have invited Sharon Gay, who is an attorney with McKenna Long Aldridge, and she is known and renowned as an expert in redevelopment powers law, and has been involved in the creation of many TADs in this state. So I think she can give you a very good overview. I might mention this. In the coming weeks, we are looking at creating scheduling a forum whereby the campaign committee will be present for that session to really talk about what their duties are, what they're trying to do, and really pass the baton on to them.
And any other campaign committee that's been formed?
Excuse me?
Any campaign committee, whether it's for or against?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So Ms. Gay is here to speak to you all.
Let me ask you this, Marie, some of the emails I've been forwarding you with some of the comments and questions, have you given any of those to her?
All of them.
Okay, so have you picked out any of the, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor Davis and members of the council. Nice to be here this afternoon. Appreciate the opportunity to work with you. And I, believe it or not, this is actually one of my favorite topics, which puts me in a very small group. I spoke at a public finance seminar a few months ago, and I told them I can do TADs in 10 minutes, 30 minutes, or an hour. Which one would you like? I'm guessing you want the 10-minute version. But I know you've thought a lot about it and learned a lot about it, or you wouldn't have put it on the ballot. But I always find it's good to sort of go back and, okay, let's remember exactly what the redevelopment powers law is and what it's derived from. And then I can talk a little bit about experiences in other jurisdictions and probably address some common misconceptions, because some of the things I'm seeing in emails I've seen many times. Okay. And it's not quite like anything else local governments deal with, and so it bears some learning. As Ms. Garrett said, I have worked on just about every tax allocation district in Georgia. Sometimes we represent a developer seeking to do a project. Sometimes we represent local government, so I have addressed it on both sides. We've done bond issues, we've done just pay-as-you-go. Just about everything you can think of, we've done at least once, so hopefully you won't have a question that I don't have some idea of the answer. But let me just back up briefly and talk about where this power comes from and what it means and what's before the voters and what it would mean if they voted yes. As you probably know, there was a 1985 amendment to the 1983 amendment to the Georgia Constitution that authorized cities and counties to exercise redevelopment powers. And that was defined as the ability to designate an area of the jurisdiction that's determined to be in need of redevelopment and create a tax allocation district to help pay for redevelopment costs for that area. And the way a TAD works, every other jurisdiction, I should back up and say that every state in the District of Columbia have some version of this. Everybody else in the country calls it tax increment financing, or TIF. We're different for reasons I can't explain, and the original author is deceased. So we'll just say we're special in Georgia. But it's the same tool. So if you read about TIFs, we're really talking about the same thing. And the process is deceptively simple in that you determine there's an area in need of redevelopment. You prepare and adopt a redevelopment plan and designate the area as a tax allocation district. At that point, the tax base, the property tax base, real and personal if you choose to include both, of the district is set as of December 31 of that year. So if next year, the voters approve it this year, next year you create a TAD, it's effective December 31 of that year, and the base value of the TAD is set at the property tax digest value that year. So let's say it's $10 million. That's the value, the assessed value of the real property. And from that point forward, the city will continue to receive the property tax revenue on that $10 million. It doesn't, reduce a dime from the taxes you're getting on that property today. But as the property is redeveloped and new value is created, the incremental increase in revenue resulting from that new value goes into a separate fund that can be used to pay redevelopment costs, which can include debt service on TAD bonds. So hence, tax increment financing. Literally, it's the incremental tax revenue resulting from the new value that is used to pay the redevelopment costs. If you create a TAD, then the city's increment goes into that special fund. The county made by resolution. The county commission can consent to the inclusion of their share of the increment in the TAD, and the Board of Education can consent to the inclusion of their share. Most of the TADs that have been done in Georgia have all three jurisdictions. There are a couple of exceptions, but generally all three jurisdictions have consented. The process is very open and transparent, and there's a lot of public input involved. The question on the ballot in November is strictly, shall the city of Brookhaven be authorized to exercise the redevelopment powers? It doesn't create a TAD, it doesn't make any debt obligation. All it does is the voters are saying, yes, we think this tool is valuable, and we want our city to have access to that tool. You would then need to look at specific areas, determine whether they meet one of the criteria for redevelopment area, and there's a long list of criteria in the state law. State law is, pages and pages. But there are three basic areas: a deteriorating or dilapidated area, or a deteriorated or distressed area, dilapidated area, or an area with inadequate infrastructure. And the statute requires a number of findings. You have to do a pretty detailed plan for, here are the conditions now, here's what we aspire to do, here are the reasons it qualifies as a TAD, here are the things that it needs, here's what private investment we expect, here's what public investment we expect. Then you hold at least one public hearing, usually there's more, on the redevelopment plan itself, and then vote whether to create the TAD. And then the county and the school board, of course, would do the same. The couple of the misconceptions that I see often are, is it a tax break? If the developer comes in and wants TAD funding, does it get a tax break? No. Everybody in the TAD pays the exact same taxes, exact same digest, exact same millage rate as everybody else. The difference is what the tax commissioner does when he or she gets the money.
Is the redevelopment powers allow for tax abatements?
No.
Okay.
It is not, it is not a tax abatement. That's a whole separate process. And in general, they're counterintuitive. This has come up a good bit in Atlanta because of there are a couple of large TADs in east and west side of downtown Atlanta, and people will come in and want to do a tax abatement through the Development Authority. And the city and the county have finally sort of agreed, as a general rule, we're not going to do tax abatement within TADs because it's kind of counterintuitive. You really, once you've agreed to do a TAD, and I tell this to my developer clients, it's also counterintuitive to them. They actually want their taxes to be as high as possible because it generates more increment. But it is not a tax abatement. It does not create a tax abatement. It is also not a tax increase. There's also a misconception about that. The word tax needs to be connected to allocation district. It is not a creation of a tax. It is an allocation of some portion of existing taxes to a separate fund to pay for redevelopment costs. And in fact, what we have found over the years is creating TADs and using that tool to generate redevelopment can often cause the property tax revenue of the city as a whole to increase. Because once you get rid of the problem, then the area around it tends to increase in value, tends to also redevelopment. And so you can end up with more overall revenue to the general fund as a result of fixing your problem areas, if you will. I think it's about 2008, 2009, the Livable Communities Coalition did a comprehensive study of the property values within all existing TADs in the region and the property values surrounding the TAD, and determined that there was a significant halo effect or multiplier effect, if you remember your Econ 101, where the property values outside the TADs increased at a more rapid rate than the city as a whole, and so you ended up with a greater overall general fund revenue, even while the TAD was still in existence. I'll give you a very specific example of that. Was in Ackworth. I was in that case working with a developer to ask the city of Ackworth to create a TAD for what became Lakeside Marketplace. It was a brownfield, had very specific environmental problems that caused the cost of the project to be much higher than they otherwise would be. So we asked the city to create a TAD to abate, to help generate revenue to abate the redevelopment costs. And I remember talking with the mayor at the time, do you want us to add any other property? You want us to increase the boundaries? He said, nope, I'm convinced if you fix this site, everything else will follow. And he was absolutely right. And what happened within 3 years after that property was abated, about $7 million in TAD bonds was issued to pay for the abatement costs and the remediation for the brownfield. All the properties around it developed, and they were getting more tax revenue from the new property development around it than they needed to pay debt service on the TAD bonds. So they came out ahead, even when they had TAD bonds outstanding, and they'll probably pay off those bonds in about a total of 15 years. So it actually can be an overall revenue increasing tool, and it certainly is not a tax increase, but it may in fact stimulate revenue. Another question that comes up a lot is, what does this mean for the general taxing power of the city? What does it mean if you issue bonds? Because one of the things that you can do in a TAD, of course, is you can issue bonds to pay for redevelopment costs. And that can either be public infrastructure costs or private redevelopment costs, basically any capital or soft cost of redevelopment that you've identified in your redevelopment plan. And people hear bonds and they start thinking, oh gosh, what does this mean for our general fund? The answer is nothing. The state law is very clear, and I'm going to read this to you because I think this is so important, and this is one of the things that I never stop repeating because I think it's so important, and it is one of the most common misconceptions. State law provides that each TAD bond or note or any other kind of obligation shall contain recitals as are necessary to show that it is only payable from the increment, and that it does not otherwise constitute an indebtedness or a charge against the general taxing power of the political subdivision or county or board of education. So even if you wanted to back a TAD or an obligation or a TAD bond by the general taxing power of the city, the state law precludes it. So if you were to issue TAD bonds, they are payable only from the increment generated within the TAD. And that's just, don't even ask. That's just not something the state law allows to do. And I will tell you, as a result, my experience has been that, and experience really all over the country, is that TAD bonds are very conservatively sized because they're not a general obligation debt. They're very conservatively sized with a significant coverage factor of debt service and debt service reserves and commitments from developers and a lot of different layers of protection that are built in. And I saw a study a few years ago about TIF bonds, the default rate for TIF bonds nationally versus general obligation bonds, and there was about a 0.5 percentage point difference. And I believe it's attributable to that careful and conservative sizing and structuring that the market requires.
What's the difference in a general obligation bond and a revenue bond?
Well, a general obligation bond is literally backed by the general taxing power of the city. If you issue a GO bond, you are committing to levy property taxes and the amount needed to pay off the debt service on the bonds. And you have to make that levy every year, and you have to set it in a separate account and can't use it for anything other than paying off the bonds, and you have to levy whatever it takes to pay off the bonds. A revenue bond is backed by a specific revenue source. Those are most often done for something that a revenue fund like a water sewer fund. That's most typically where you would see a revenue bond, where there is a fee for a service, and you issue bonds to pay for some of the infrastructure, and then that fee is adjusted to pay the debt service. And I live in Atlanta, and we're paying just about the highest water sewer rates in the country because that's what it takes to pay debt service on the bonds to fix the sewers. Yeah, I know. Just wanted to make you feel a little better. So a TAD is a form of revenue bond in that the revenue is the tax increment, but it's not a fee, it's property tax revenue, but it is more akin to a revenue bond than a general obligation bond, which it most assuredly is not. I thought it might be helpful just to, I know you probably are aware of a lot of these projects, but it might be helpful just to give you a couple of examples, sort of refresh everybody's recollection for how they've been used, some in the metro area. Probably the most familiar TAD was the first one, Atlantic Steel. That TAD was created, 138-acre brownfield, had not one bit of usable infrastructure, no water, no sewer, no roads, no street lights, nothing. And it was a brownfield. And so the city of Atlanta created the Atlantic Steel TAD in 1999. It was about the second thing I did when I came to my firm in 1999 was to get the city and the county and the school board to consent to that TAD. And the city has, over the years, issued two different series of bonds in 2001 and 2006 for about $180,000 altogether to pay for...
180,000?
I mean, excuse me. Thank you. $180 million. Yeah, there was, or it's a little less, yeah, there was about 180 million in net proceeds. It was $76 million bond issue and $150 million bond issue. One resulted in about 180 million net proceeds to the project, which were used to do the environmental remediation and capping and build huge stormwater infrastructure and other significant infrastructure, sort of 50-year infrastructure, 100-year infrastructure in the project, and to pay for some of the parking structure, part of which is actually capping the inert matter, the slag, the byproduct of steel. And that's, resulted in the property you see today. Before the TAD was created, that property was paying about $500,000 in property taxes to the City County Board of Ed. It's north of 20 million today, and it's not even fully built out. And, it simply would not have happened without the tax allocation district. And again, the halo effect, all sorts of developments around, and not within Atlantic Station TAD, but all sorts of development around the TAD is happening. The values of the houses in Home Park and Loring Heights skyrocketed because they were next to a new neighborhood rather than a brownfield. And that's an example of a project-specific TAD. The TAD was created specifically for that project, big area, but a specific project. It was easy to figure out what the redevelopment plan said. It was really the master plan for the development. By contrast, I would point out the ones I alluded to earlier, the East Side TAD, which is the east side of downtown, and the West Side TAD, which is sort of the Centennial Park and area where the new dome is going to be, and sort of going over to the single-family neighborhoods to the west. Those were really designed to stimulate a broad range of redevelopment in and around downtown. The West Side came along right after the Olympics. Everybody was afraid nothing would ever happen, and what happens to all the land around the Centennial Park. And so two different series of bonds have been issued for about 25 different projects, everything from the first high-rise residential downtown to hotels. Some of the money went into the Center for Civil and Human Rights, to the World of Coke. There have been office buildings, just a whole range of it. My office we're right downtown and faces west, and I literally look out on the West Side TAD and just can count all the projects that have been created since the TAD went into effect. And all of that, of course, generates sales tax revenue and business license fees and all those things that come with economic development. The city, Augusta Richmond County, has been very aggressive in using TADs. They have created 2 or 3 different sort of larger area TADs, and that happened not long before the recession, so they haven't had it's not like they had 20 projects. But what they have done is in a couple of cases, have recruited significant industries or significant retail developments by entering into what we just would call sort of a pay-as-you-go agreement. What they've done is said, okay, Mr. Manufacturer, you want to come and build a $115 million plant within this TAD, we will agree to write you a check every year, enter into a development agreement that spells out what you're going to do and what we're going to do, and we will pay you your share of the increment. Whatever increment is created in the TAD as a result of your project, we'll write you a check for that share of the increment every year until either a certain number is reached or 15 years, whichever first occurs. So there's no debt issued, but the project gets the benefit of that cash flow.
So you don't have to use a TAD to incur debt. You can just use a TAD to give them the increment. So that's
right.
So there's no risk, basically, except to anybody but the industry there?
That's right. We'll pay it where is, as is, and if is. And, whatever's in the pot after reduction of our administrative costs, you get.
So the taxpayers aren't on the hook for anything?
That's right.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that you could do that.
In fact, some of what the East Side and West Side TADs in
There's
downtown.
no risk to that for the
That's right.
taxpayers, except to the company that's coming in.
That's right. That's right. Now,
Can you tell
the
me some
reason
examples of where a TAD has gone horribly wrong?
not in Georgia.
I mean, there's got to be some places.
There were some.
What were the ones for the
some of
landfill? Wasn't there in North Georgia, there was a landfill or something that didn't develop or something like that?
No, that was the success story I told you, my perfect TAD.
Susan, where?
Was it a general obligation bond or something that may have?
No, it was the landfill and a junkyard lot.
Yeah, landfill.
But that's,
It's Ackworth.
the Ackworth one is the one that is the great success story.
I thought that
Right.
was that the bad one or the good one? I thought that was
It was a very bad property.
It's beautiful. I mean, they have all kinds of businesses there now.
Okay.
Yeah, that was we were kind of late to the party. This tool started getting used in the 60s and early 70s, And I know there were some defaults in Michigan in the
I'm talking about
early.
here in Georgia. I want to know,
No.
because we're hearing, that this can be a horribly bad thing. And I want to know if there are any in Georgia where a
The-
city
the-
or a county's been down, granted these type of redevelopment powers, where the government has made a bad decision and the TAD has ended up leaving the taxpayers on the hook.
Well, those two things can't happen.
That's sure.
Even if they did make a bad decision or got on the wrong side of the market, the taxpayers are not on the hook. It's the bondholders who are left holding the bag. So Gwinnett created 3 TADs in 2008.
So say that one more time. I want to
Okay.
make sure I was
Okay.
clear.
Yeah.
The taxpayers cannot be left
That's right.
holding.
If there is not enough increment to pay the debt service,
Right.
let's say we issue $10 million in bonds and we have another crazy recession and the property values don't increase as projected. And let's say you've got a 10% debt service reserve, you run through that. You've got a year in capitalized interest, you run through that. And then there's still not, you look in the pot and there's still not enough increment to pay the debt service next year. The bondholders are stuck. That's why they want them sized conservatively. I mean, they're sophisticated investors. These are sold to sophisticated investors. They know what they want. The bonds are sized conservatively. It's a higher interest rate than a general obligation bond. I mean, right now, I think they're running about 5.5%, 6%, which is not bad, but it's a lot higher than a general obligation bond. But if all of those protections are not sufficient, and generally that would be because the project just didn't happen for some reason, then the bondholders are left holding the bag. And typically, they just wait because eventually the project gets done and they get caught up. But
Is that similar to what's been going on with the Beltline Invest Atlanta?
yeah, I was going to say, let me talk about that because I know that's in the paper. And I even had a lawyer who teaches a class at Georgia State email me and say, I can't figure it out. Would you please explain it so I can explain it to my class? Here's what's going on, and I will give you the caveat that our firm has been engaged recently by the Board of Education just to give some strategic advice. We're not involved in litigation, but I just want to make that disclosure. The Beltline is a little different from every other TAD. And I always remind my developer clients this when they come asking, what can I get from the Beltline TAD? And my answer is nothing. The Beltline TAD was created to provide funding for the Beltline itself. The idea was that once the idea of the Beltline and the trails and the parks and the transit came along, that everybody would want to develop around the Beltline. And so they created a TAD that literally is the circle that is to be the Beltline running about, a quarter of a mile in either direction. And as new projects happen and there is new increment, then that increment is used to build more of the Beltline, to build the next mile of trails, to buy more parkland, to buy more right-of-way. So it really is purely saying, if we say we will build it, they will come, and then we will be able to build it. And it's big. It's about 4.5% of the digest. The school board was a little more reluctant to agree to that TAD than they had been to agree to prior TADs, partly because it was big, partly because they couldn't quite figure out what it meant for them, and so the city and the school board entered into intergovernmental agreement, and I'll come back to IGAs because doing something with the county and the school board is not uncommon, but this was a little unusual, and that the city agreed to pay the school board an annual payment in lieu of taxes, a pilot payment of a certain amount each year. And they based that, rather than, some previous deals had been a percentage of the bond proceeds. Whenever we issue, like West Side, whenever we issue bonds, if it's more than 10 million or more than 15 million, you get 5. And they did, and they invested it in Centennial Elementary School, and it's an award-winning elementary school. But this was, we will write you a check every year starting in year X from our share from the increment. This was pre-crash. So the projections were just candidly turned out to be wildly optimistic in light of the crash. Now, there's a tremendous amount of Beltline redevelopment happening now, but they're behind. So literally, the city doesn't have in the Beltline TAD the amount of money needed to get current
With the
on that
school board.
obligation to the
Yes.
school board, yes.
And it's
So they made an
because of
IGA.
that pilot, that side IGA agreement, that they really
That's right.
circumvented that barrier to access city general funds.
No, it's still not a general fund obligation.
That's right.
And that's part of the challenge, because the school board says, well, they just write us a check out of the general fund. No, can't do that. So
It was the school board made a bad deal.
Well, or everybody made it a bad deal. You know, it was based on projections that just didn't hold when property values went upside down.
So it's not the taxpayers who are holding the bag on
That's
that
right.
still?
That's right. And there may have been news reports that were a little confusing about that.
Yeah.
But it's still an obligation that it's a redevelopment cost. A pilot payment is a redevelopment cost. And so it can only be satisfied out of the increment. So if the increment is not there, then there is no general fund obligation. Now, the school board has suggested things to the city, you know, as a matter of good faith. Why don't you give us the civic center for a high school or things like that? But those are things that the city could choose to do to kind of settle the dispute.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not something that the intergovernmental agreement can compel them to do.
Okay.
And there's also been some suggestion that perhaps there are bonds outstanding and the school, you know, it have an impact on the bonds, and that's not true. There is a small debt outstanding, but you pay that first.
Okay.
Do all TADs have to go with the county and the school system?
Well, thank you for reminding me that I wanted to get that. Nearly all of them do, just because you get literally more bang for the buck. You know, the county and the school board are a significant share of the increment. The Princeton Lakes TAD in southwest Atlanta has city and county only, did not have a school board pledge. I have typically found that the counties, and usually it's cities creating TADs. There have been a couple of, like the Clayton County, the Ellenwood TAD is unincorporated Clayton, but most of them are in cities because that's more where there's more scalable development. I have found counties generally are fairly willing to participate because there's not a big service delivery demand on them, quite frankly, and they get the benefit of the new development. School boards tend to be slower to come to
So
the
you
table.
could do one and just leave the school board out?
That's right, yeah.
And you don't have to have the county, and you could do it
That's
just
right.
purely city, even though we have a pretty small millage rate?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Peachtree Corners has redevelopment powers, and they don't have a
Have
property
no-
tax levy, so that, you know, creating a TAD in Peachtree Corners is going to be interesting. But they have the redevelopment powers. Yeah, it's strictly a matter of how much revenue you can generate, and therefore how fast you could build out your redevelopment plan. But the TAD is effective once you create it. And if the county consents, their money's in, the school board consents, their money's in,
But
but
the
only
actual
if.
plan that you would have to come up with goes through a fair amount of scrutiny.
Yes, yes.
Public hearings, vetting.
There's a list
the
of about
council-
28 things that have to be
That has to be
included.
fulfilled by law,
Yes, that is,
and then a vote of the council.
that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, you must advertise at least one, and hold at least one public hearing. You have to advertise the vote. You have to make the redevelopment plan available to the public. I've never seen a redevelopment plan less than 40 pages. Typically, they're more like 80, because there are significant requirements that the state law has.
Are you aware of what cities in the metro area have redevelopment powers and which ones do not?
I have a list I can provide you. Right off the top of my head, I'll say most everybody. The newer cities are having to, you know, make that decision. There was a big flurry of referenda in 85 and 86 and 87 after the law was adopted.
Right.
So everybody from East Point to College Park, Atlanta, Marietta, Ackworth, Canton, Smyrna, Dunwoody,
Dunwoody has it?
yeah, they had the referendum. They haven't done a
But
TAD.
they've got a
I
referendum.
thought they did I mean, I had the same conversation with them 18 months ago. I'm pretty sure they had the referendum, but I'll double check. We can get. Doraville, yes. I'm not sure about Chamblee.
Do you feel it puts a city at a competitive disadvantage for if neighboring cities have that ability, and
Absolutely.
why?
And I say this, and anytime GMA or ACCG asks me to speak about TADs, I say this: get this tool in your toolbox. We just don't have in Georgia as many local economic development tools as a lot of other states do. Our legislature, for whatever reason, chooses not to give us some of the tools that a lot of other states have. So we already start out, I believe, local governments start out a little bit of a competitive disadvantage. I think this is the single most powerful tool that the state allows local governments to exercise, because it doesn't
That statement, though, is what is causing some, I think, angst, is that it's a
It's
very
powerful.
powerful tool. And I want to make sure that you've answered it twice, because I've asked you, that the taxpayers aren't left holding. That's what the,
I will never, you can never say that enough. With powerful tools come powerful controls.
right.
And the legislature has done that. I mean, when we reenacted the law in 2009, I literally wrote or rewrote every word of it. So I'm
Well,
real clear about what it
let-
says.
So here's
Let's-
the next
hang on.
criticism that's going to happen when people watch this. Oh, of course she's for TAS. She works for a firm. That's what she does for a living. there's a conflict of interest in your promotion of, how do you vet yourself? How do you withstand that type of criticism?
Well,
I know
I'm a
someone said
lawyer in
that-
private practice. People are always going to say that about me. But
Right.
I did work in local government and state and local government for 10 years before I came to my firm. And I believe in community redevelopment.
Right.
I live in Inman Park in a house that was built in 1896, condemned in 1970. I live in, one of the oldest neighborhoods in our region. And I work downtown. I have for my entire career, and I don't even remember how many years that is. I have seen the difference that community redevelopment can make to a mature city, to an emerging city, to an urban area, to a suburban area. You're an inner tier, urban, suburban mix. That's the place where things need to happen. One of the things about TADs is, if people ask me, are these for just the worst areas in town? The answer is no, because it's not enough money. You're going to need other money, and private market's probably not going to come in. What a TAD is best suited for is an area that's on the downward slide, and either was great once and is kind of sliding downhill, or maybe it was never that great and is getting aging and deteriorating buildings and infrastructure. It's a great tool to lift that area back up before it gets beyond easy repair.
Or speed the process of redevelopment.
That's exactly right. And
So instead of a 30-year window, you have a 5 or 10-year window.
that's exactly right. And
So we
and
all
sort
be
of back-
alive to see the improvements.
That's right.
Let me get on with J-Max, with your statement about the worst-case scenario. So when you talk about Invest in Atlanta, that's sort of the poster child right now of a difficult, challenging situation. Some people
But a
are
very
using
unusual
that.
one.
Yeah. When you look at that's in litigation, or I don't know if it's being litigated yet, but certainly the lawyers
Everybody's-
are interacting.
Right, yeah, the
and-
lawyers are sending letters.
Right.
yes.
So who pays that burden of cost for the if it does go to litigation? Would that be just an obligation of the city itself?
Well, I
even
don't
though
know. I don't-
damages or payments
Yeah,
might
I
be-
guess I wouldn't, it's not a matter of damages. It's a matter of, can the contract be, shall the contract be enforced? Can the contract be enforced? There are principles of litigation, and I'm not going to try to practice law for you. I'll let your city attorney do that. But there are certain concepts in Georgia law where if contracts are incapable of performance, they can be reformed to reflect the facts. That's possible. My personal guess is it'll end up in mediation.
Right.
But, as
What
to.
the Beltline one, would they be?
Invest in Atlanta.
That
yeah.
would be my guess.
Yeah.
Again, wild guess on my part. It is a very unusual situation because it's an unusual TAD and it's an unusual set of facts. As to how the city and the school board pay their legal costs, I don't know. I would guess the city would pay it out of the TAD because it is TAD-specific expense.
Yeah.
I don't know about APS. And sometimes that's come up even when school boards are trying to consider whether to consent to a TAD. They want
Okay.
either the city or the developer to pay them a little fee for the cost of their financial experts analyzing it, and that's been done from time to time.
Let me ask you, I've got a couple more specific questions, and I know you've been very thorough, but I want to get these out of the way if I can. So are the redevelopment powers, and let's say there's a bond obligation that is done, is that bond issue done by the city or the
Yes.
development authority?
Yes. It is,
So-
there are,
By the city, not the development
that's right.
authority.
The law allows you to designate a redevelopment agent. You may designate a development authority, you may create a redevelopment agency specifically for this, or you could retain that power in the mayor and council, which is what East Point chose to do, for example, which was interesting when we had to get paid, but they chose to just retain the redevelopment powers in the city and council. There are certain powers and certain roles and responsibilities that can be delegated to a redevelopment agency. And in Atlanta, that's what they've done, and it designated Invest Atlanta as their
Right.
redevelopment agency. So they say, okay, you're in charge, you take proposals, you structure deals, you bring them to us. The powers that cannot be delegated are the powers to create the TAD, to adopt the redevelopment plan, and to issue bonds. The city would be the issuer.
Okay.
And you would go through all those public processes and public votes that we talked about.
And so if these TAD bonds were issued for a development, the bonds are issued by the city, that monetizes that future incremental tax increase. What's the limit of those bonds? And is that,
Yeah,
How is that
s-
determined?
The statute says they can be issued for a maximum of 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
The longest I've seen is 25. There's a funny math, if I had my little graph, this would be easier to see, but typically, the reasoning is you size them for 20 or 25 years, but quite likely they'll be paid off more quickly. Because once the project is built and it continues to increase in value every year, the increment is going to keep going up. But you have sized the bonds based on a projection of increment at a point in time. So if you thought you were going to have $1 million in increment, but by year 7, you've got $1.2 million, $1.4 million, you can pay the bonds off faster or invest it in other projects. So at the Ackworth example that I gave you, that was a 15-year bond, but they'll pay it off in probably 11 years. But
So-
30 is the maximum.
So all the affected properties that would be subject to this tax allocation district, how many of them have to sign off on them, and what sort of approval process do they get, or is it?
0 and none.
It's really up to
Because
the
it has no impact on
the
them.
city.
That's right. They pay the same property tax rate, the same millage rate that everybody else pays. They write a check to the tax commissioner just like everybody else. What the tax commissioner does when he gets it is what's different. And literally, they have to figure out, they have to cue in for every single property what that base value is. So that if my property's in the TAD and it was worth $1 million the year it was created, and 5 years later it's worth $1.5 million, they have to take my share of the property taxes on that $500,000 and send it to the city for the special fund.
Let me ask a quick question on that one. So at December 31st, you're setting the tax digest. And
Right.
it's the property value, it could be personal, but whatever, if it's the property value. So it's set. Now you have your increment, and that is used to pay down the TAD, the bond on that. Does that mean that the property owners always pay that December 31st property tax?
Good,
Well,
important question.
Because if you're going to have the halo effect, it's also going to affect the center.
No, that's an important question, and I apologize if I was not clear enough. The base value is the value of the property tax digest as of that point. The tax levy is whatever the tax levy is in any given year. The millage rate is not affected. The millage rate is the same inside the TAD as it is outside the TAD. So the same millage rate will generate more revenue as the property value goes up within the TAD. So it's that incremental increase in revenue resulting from the new value, not the incremental value, but the incremental increase in revenue resulting from the new value that goes to pay debt service. So property owner inside a TAD and outside a TAD pay the same tax rate, just where their money goes once it's paid is what's different.
But let's take that let's put some real numbers to it. So if the TAD had a valuation of $10 million and, just use an arbitrary number, the next year its assessed valuation is $15 million, that the property owner would have to pay the $15 million tax rate. It's just that the city, the school, and the county would all get that $10 million valuation money, and then that remaining $5 million of tax revenue would go to the TAD prepayment.
Exactly. And
So-
Mayor Davis, back to your question earlier about why do I believe in them, another reason I think it's a valuable tool is for precisely that reason. The city and the county and the school board don't lose a dime in today's revenue. You continue to get the revenue you were getting before the TAD was created. What you're doing is investing future revenue to make redevelopment happen faster and to improve conditions faster, change the dynamic faster than either you or the private sector would be able to do on your own.
Well, now let's say there's a property owner who's in the TAD that we designate, and they say, look, I'm barely making ends meet. I don't particularly want my property to go up in assessed value. Whereas right next to them, you're going to build this great development that's going to make their property extremely valuable. Well, how about that property owner? What can they do?
I
Are they
have never
subject to the
seen
free
that
market?
happen, but yeah, I mean, you could, if they're really loud, you could carve them out. I mean, the boundary is sort of whatever. My theory is you
You
can.
said carve them out,
Yeah.
not cart them out.
Well, if they're really annoying in a meeting, you might want to cart them out, but you probably just carve them out. Yeah, I mean, for example, the East Side TAD downtown carved out Peachtree Center because at the time, people felt like that was a fairly mature property, could likely just remain the same way it was for a number of years, didn't really need any help, but wasn't really going to change much. They carved out a couple of the newer hotels for that exact same reason.
There's still, property value still went up.
Right, but it goes in the general fund.
Right.
And so, yeah, their values continue to increase. And so, to say, I don't want my property values to go up means I want everything else to continue to
Stagnant.
decline. There's no stagnant. It's either going up or it's going down. Right. And so that's one of those that,
All right, last question. Last question, we've got to move on. I just wanted, there's an email from a fellow who's been pretty hot about this issue, telling folks it's a really bad idea, and I want to address some of his concerns.
Okay.
We had a Parks Master Plan, and some folks are connecting the Parks Master Plan to us wanting to get redevelopment powers, which I don't understand that. But it says, in our Parks Master Plan, it says Georgia law mandates that general obligation debt issued by cities and counties cannot exceed 10% of the assessed value of all taxable property. For Brookhaven, this equates to a legal debt margin of $277 million. All right. So what he's saying is.
Limit,
Yeah.
they're limited to.
So what he's saying is that sentence is the definition of the cap on revenue bonds created by redevelopment powers. Is that, does the redevelopment powers put a cap on revenue bonds?
they're two different things. They're in separate parts of the Constitution. The Constitution allows you to issue general obligation debt, and there's the 10% cap. Coincidentally, there's a 10% number in the redevelopment powers law, but it's completely different. What the redevelopment powers law says is that you cannot put more than 10% of the value of digest in TADs. And in fact, that was a big deal for the Beltline. At the time that Beltline TAD was created, they had to tweak it to make sure that they didn't go over their 10% of total value of the digest in all of their TADs. And it's not a debt limit, it's a how much property can be in a TAD limit. That might be 10 TADs, that might be 1 TAD.
Right.
Now, by definition, that'll limit how much you can issue in TAD bonds, because you can only issue TAD bonds based on the properties inside the TAD. So it just so happens that our legislature chose 10% for each of those measures, but they're very different. And the general obligation debt doesn't have anything to do with the TAD bond debt.
So redevelopment powers do not create a cap on revenue bonds?
Well, I would say it this way. The redevelopment powers law creates a cap on the amount of property value you can put in a TAD.
Okay.
And you can only issue TAD bonds supported by the increment from the redevelopment that occurs within your TADs. And so you are limited. It doesn't matter what the legislature or the math says. You can only issue bonds based on what you can size, based on projected redevelopment. And a way you would do this is you would enter, certainly any bonds you were issuing for private redevelopment, but even if it's public, you're going to enter into a redevelopment agreement with the developer or developers, if you've got more than one, that spells out in great detail what they're going to build. Then you hire a fiscal consultant to figure out how that's going to be valued by the tax assessor and when that's going to come on the tax rolls, because it might be built over several years. Then you hire a feasibility consultant to determine, is that really viable? Is there really a market for that project? Does it make sense? And your underwriter is going to take all that information and show it to investors, who will then say, okay, I'm willing to buy those on an interest rate of 6% and a coverage factor of 1.4. Mm-hmm. That determines how much you can issue in TAD bonds.
Okay.
So it's really
It is
determined
a
by the markets.
It is a market-driven number, and it is a very
So
conservative
redevelopment powers
market.
do not put a cap on revenue bonds, they put a cap on how much property can go into the TAD that the redevelopment powers.
And J-Max, the caveat to that is, even at the maximum exposure, there's no exposure to the taxpayers in any of that.
And it sounds like the number for Brookhaven would be, if those numbers are right, 290-something.
77 million.
$277 million, but the property value would be the limit of how
Multiple
much could
TADs.
go into all of our TADs.
Right.
Now, let me ask this. If there was I'm going to use a specific. If there was a project, for example, on Beaufort Highway that we wanted to do, and it encompassed a certain amount of acreage, and we're trying to come up with a tax assessment of property value, it would be limited to the actual physical property where it was going to be built, or what would the city do to
Well,
determine?
that's an important question. I mean, the boundaries can be sort of whatever you want them to be.
We could bring the halo effect in for evaluation.
That's right. Generally, what you do is you've got a project or a series of projects in mind, and you take a look at the definitions, which definition of redevelopment area does this fit under, and what is sort of the logical area For example, the city of Atlanta has used TADs for a couple of the Atlanta Housing Authority redevelopments, Techwood Homes, and then the old Perry Bolton became West Highlands. And the city planners came in and said, we'd like the boundaries of the TAD for the old Perry Homes to be a little broader than the footprint of Perry Homes because we want to do some infrastructure improvements along the streets. So that TAD, I call it the TADosaurus because it has this body that's the old Perry Bolton, and then it goes up one right-of-way, picks up another area that's smaller and comes back down. So it looks kind of like a body with a neck and a head. You can gerrymander. But that's an important question, and you want, that's something you want your planning and your economic development staff to be attuned to. It doesn't do you any good to create one that's too small to generate any increment. But you have to be mindful of what my next step is. If I create this one and I use 1% of the value of my digest, I've got 9% left, and I might do this area and then this area. If you've got one big project, as a very general rule, you need $7 or $8 million in TAD bond capacity for it to be economically efficient to issue bonds, as opposed to the pay-as-you-go structure that we talked about. So you need critical mass, but the answer to how big it is going to differ depending on what projects are out there, how much public infrastructure you need, and sort of what makes sense in terms of a logical planning area.
All right, so I really appreciate your help. You've been very, very helpful.
Glad to do it.
We knew, had a surface level understanding of what this redevelopment powers are, and still do to a certain extent. Would you be willing to do a 10-question FAQ for us, just to let people know what they are and what they aren't, so people can make an informed decision whether they like this or they don't like it? You can coordinate that with Maria.
Happy to.
We would like to have something quickly, if you could,
Yeah,
just to put on our city news site and some other places.
I have 2 or 3 versions that I've done over the years because the questions are all very similar, and I'll just update that for
Okay.
the current
And
environment.
then, second, last thing, because we have to go. Beaufort Highway was what we were looking at when we asked the legislator to put this on the referendum for this November. You had said earlier that the TADs are good for places that were once thriving and are on decline, or just an area that's stagnated. I mean, Beaufort Highways was once a lot more thriving. It's thriving in ways that some are good and some bad right now.
When I was in law school, everybody lived in Beaufort Highway.
Right. Would you say, I know you're going to say yes to this, but what is unique about Beaufort Highway in our city that you think that that this redevelopment powers would be beneficial for?
Yes, if you asked me to look at the whole region, that would be one of my top 5 for some of the reasons you
really?
just said. It's
It
got
would.
some bone structure. It's got some roadway infrastructure. It's got a history to it. It's got
Great location.
it's near the interstate and near the airports, and it's got a lot of great bone structure to it, but it's got some challenges in terms of everything from sidewalks to parks to streetscapes to low-value properties and absentee owners and things that aren't performing. And so what I would imagine, and I'm not a developer and I'm not a planner, but I talk to both of them a lot, is that what a TAD might enable you to do is attract developers who wouldn't have been interested before because there just wasn't enough market without some assistance. Now, what you're really doing, a newspaper editor asked me one time, isn't this really just for the worst developers? I said, no, it's really for the best developers. It's really for the people who know what they're doing, but the market on its own is not quite there because the needs are greater than the market value today will support. And so then you could use, in the early stages, you might do a couple of, ideally, some catalytic, but 2 or 3, you might end with 2 or 3 private developments that will begin to stimulate redevelopment interest. Then maybe the next phase comes along, and there's some of that money you use for public infrastructure as well as the private development, or have the developers, okay, will you do a mile of sidewalk or whatever the level of need is. I would imagine you might do a combination of incentive to make the private development happen, but also corridor improvements that make the corridor more attractive faster.
Right.
Like Berry lines,
Very utility lines.
Berry utility
Yes,
lines.
exactly. Get a uniform streetscape, get more street lights, make it, calm it, or whatever, street diets, or whatever we've been talking about in the region these days.
Well, thank you.
But it's got a coherent identity to it that I would think would work well.
Well, thank you very,
Extremely
very much.
informative.
Appreciate it.
Our pleasure,
And we'll be
and-
seeing you soon, I'm sure.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.